join our panel discussion. So thank you very much for joining our session on how to strengthen social capital to build resilience to natural disasters. So this session, the panel discussion, is organized by the Canada Caribbean Resilience Facility, which is part of GFDRR, which is a global facility for disaster risk reduction and recovery. So the Canada Caribbean Resilience Facility, what we do is we work with 9 countries in the Caribbean to improve gender and climate change integration in disaster risk management. So in the way countries prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters, and as well as in how do they prepare and implement their budgets, including budgeting for disaster risk management. So in today's session, what we want to do is really highlight some of the impressive work that's been done in the Caribbean in integrating gender in disaster risk management and in budgeting. And we will also use this opportunity to have a mini knowledge exchange session between the Caribbean and the Pacific. So acknowledging that both regions are highly prone to natural disasters and that they have adopted a slightly different approach to integrating gender in budgeting and in disaster risk management. So we want to hear from their experience. My name is Urszka Zrinski. I am Senior Public Sector Specialist at the World Bank, and I'm also a team member of the Canada Caribbean Resilience Facility, and I'll be moderating this session. So let me sit down and we will start. So in today's session, what we want to do is highlight the following key issues. First, to acknowledge that disasters do not have an equal effect on everyone. That children, women and girls, elderly people, persons with disabilities and indigenous people, and particularly in lower income countries, are often disproportionately affected by disasters. And that understanding the differential needs of community members is really essential for effective disaster risk management and supporting inclusive recovery. And what we also want to do is to present how countries around the world, and we now know that there are more than 80 countries that systematically integrate gender in the way they design budget policies, including for disaster risk management. And we want to highlight some of those successes. So we have 4 speakers today with us, 2 joining in person in Florianopolis and 2 connecting online. So we have with us Mr. Jamie Saunders, who's the Executive Director of the Directorate of Gender Affairs in Antigua and Barbuda. He's also a founding member of the nonprofit organization Initiate Spark, which seeks to become a catalyst in the promotion of charity and civic responsibility in Antigua and Barbuda. As you'll see, Mr. Saunders is passionate about gender, social justice, development issues, and youth leadership. We also have with us Ms. Kalera Kolivoso-Ravono. She's from Fiji. So she's a manager for the social services sector at the Ministry of Economy under the Budget and Planning Division. And she's been leading all of Fiji's engagements in really introducing and implementing gender budgeting. While she's a government official at the Ministry of Economy in Fiji, she's also working as a short-term consultant for the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and she's been involved with the IMF to conduct gender assessments of public financial management. And I've had the privilege to work with her in Tonga. We also have, as I said, 2 panelists joining online. The first one is Naima Imam Chowdhury. She's the Senior Gender Equality Policy Advisor at Global Affairs Canada. She's an expert in feminist approach and leadership, gender equality and inclusion. She has extensive experience working on these issues with countries in Asia, Africa, and in Americas. And her most recent development work includes climate change adaptation, mitigation, disaster risk management, women, peace, and security. And last but not least, and I'll actually ask our technical team if we could now connect to the speakers. We'll have our colleague from the World Bank, Eliana Rubiano-Matulevic, joining us. She's senior economist in Latin America and the Caribbean. She's been instrumental working with us under the Canada Caribbean Resilience Facility to conduct research on how gender is integrated in disaster risk management across the Caribbean. She's also leads the work on improving the availability of sex disaggregated data and gender statistics at the country level. So thank you to all the panelists for joining our discussion today. And if okay, I'd like to now open our panel discussion and start with you, Jamie. As part of the Canada Caribbean Resilience Facility, we conducted in 2019 a study across the Caribbean on how gender is integrated in disaster risk management and particularly budgeting for disaster risk management. And what we notice across the Caribbean is that there's rarely close cooperation between the National Gender Unit and National Disaster Risk Management Agency. However, that is not the case in Antigua and Barbuda, where I think to a large extent, thanks to you, there's been close cooperation between your department, right, the Directorate for Gender Affairs, and the National Disaster Risk Management Agency, really trying to think through how do we mainstream gender in disaster risk management. And I know you've been doing some wonderful work on that, so we would love to learn more about your engagements.
Thank you very much. Good day, everyone. I just start by thanking the World Bank for the opportunity to be able to share some of what we are doing in Antigua and Barbuda. So our Ministry of Finance does work along closely with us. You know, Antigua is a small island developing state in the Leeward Islands, so we definitely operate within a limited fiscal space. And so as you can imagine, issues related to gender equality and social issues may not always be the preeminent priority of the day. However, through support from international development partners, such as the World Bank and even a project that was supported by the government of the UK, a European Development Fund, our Ministry of Finance was able to kind of facilitate greater partnership with us to understand how, from a policy perspective, they could really adjust how they seek to mainstream gender considerations and financial decisions throughout our civil, and public service. And so under the European Development Fund, they were able to conduct trainings with different departments and ministries to really understand the basic foundation of what gender equality is. And I think what really made it effective was that it was the understanding that you're not going to achieve everything within one day. But what is important is that sensitization, because I think something that tends to elude a lot of people is that, I may be involved in the Ministry of Agriculture or the Ministry of Tourism. So what does this have to do with gender? But gender is a very cross-cutting issue. And so what the Ministry of Finance in conjunction with us has been trying to do is to really just set the foundation by doing a number of trainings, educational campaigns and PSAs around letting persons understand that every plan, the government, action, policy, protocol should have some consideration about how this project is going to affect men, how it's going to affect women, how it's going to affect persons even with disabilities. And so as a result, we've seen this take place in terms of construction projects. So we have a road rehabilitation project, simple things like signs that say men at work. Through our trainings, we're able to have them understand, it should say people at work, simple things like lighting and road detours, understanding how that may affect a single mother with a child and her having to take a new certain route. So there's really a plethora of ways in which this can happen. I know we're short on time, so I'll just give one more example. Our Department of Environment was one of the first islands in the Caribbean, if not the first, to gain access to the Green Climate Fund. And that allowed us to have access to millions of dollars to finance climate change and disaster risk reduction plans. So DOE, as well as the Ministry of Finance and Gender Affairs, has kind of been able to work along with them in terms of making sure these projects and financing and resource allocation is gender responsive. And one of the reasons why that has been able to be very effective is the fact that the GCF already has very comprehensive gender equality reporting requirements in terms of, baseline reporting, prioritizing certain groups and ensuring that there's that cross-sectoral participation and level of inclusivity to ensure that the projects are meeting the needs of all persons. And so we have been able to make some strides. We do still have some gaps, but I think we have a solid foundation to work from to ensure that we are at least integrating some of the most basic gender principles within our finance structure and mechanisms.
Thank you very much, Jamie. And I want to stick to the topic of gender and disaster risk management and move to you, Kalera, and Fiji's experience in integrating gender and in disaster risk management. And I find the story of Fiji particularly fascinating. And the reason is that in Fiji, it was the parliament who suggested to the government that gender should be integrated in disaster risk management, but also in the way the government prepares and implements its budget. And I believe it was in 2019 when the Parliament of Fiji established that during cyclones and other disasters, women were the first to help their communities by organizing immediate relief work for families. But women were not systematically included in disaster risk management. So the Parliament, therefore, instructed the government to start mainstreaming gender in design and implementation of policies for disaster risk management and the way it also budgets for those policies. So Kalera, we would like to learn more from you about how the government has taken on this advice, but particularly how gender is mainstream in disaster risk management in Fiji. So over to you.
Thank you, Urshka. Okay, for us Fijis was really interesting because, like what Urshka said, we commenced with this GRB process, the initiative in our budget process in 2019. So that was also after the PIFA assessment that was undertaken by the PIFTEC team. And we've seen also the gaps in terms of looking at gender in our budget process. And during the time when we were undertaking our reforms as well, in reforming our budget process and documentation, we thought to really take this on board and start off with gender responsive budgeting. But it's quite interesting because I know that every country that would have started with GRB in their budget process, if we are asked from Ministry of Finance, if I'm asked, have you sensitized gender in your budget process? I would say, yes, I've already done that. We've already been giving money. It's already been supporting both male and female. And that's the mentality that I have from the Ministry of Finance. But when we started with the gender responsive budgeting, and then we realized how the gaps were there, that there were some that were excluded from the, or don't have access to this program. So those were the interesting things that we actually learned from this budget process. But in terms of looking at it from with how we mainstreamed it to disaster risk management, Fiji has systems in place to provide the support in the immediate aftermath of cyclones. And you know that Fiji, we can have about 3 or maximum of 4 cyclones in a year. And there was a cluster committee that was established, and it was chaired by the permanent secretary for women, with 47 member agencies from civil society, our international NGOs, the United Nations agencies, the development partners, and the private sector, as well as other government agencies from the Ministry of Health, Education, and Fiji Police Force. So there are 4 main technical groups that were formed under this cluster, which are the gender-based violence, the child protection, data monitoring and evaluation, and counseling and psychosocial subclusters. The cluster members are active during prevention and response phases. This includes work before, during, and after disaster emergency periods. The cluster was a critical mechanism for supporting vulnerable cohorts during our COVID-19 pandemic. The Safety and Protections Cluster is guided by the National Disaster Management Act, the Fiji Human Rights Policy for Disaster Risk Management, and the National Disaster Risk Reduction Policy. So these documents, they were developed by our National Disaster Management Office and incorporate key targets of the SEDI framework and disaster risk reduction, and are also aligned to our national policy and legislations like the Fiji National Gender Policy, which is currently in review, the National Development Plan, along with our National Climate Policy and our new Climate Change Act, which was developed in last year. The Fiji cluster system ensures gender responsive interventions. So the gender-based violence subcluster monitors factors that increase vulnerability and disseminates public messages about assistance. The service delivery protocol and identifies referrals and roles during disasters. We have women-friendly spaces provided for safe spaces for women and children, social assistance program, which accounts about 8% of our total 12% of our total expenditure in government are also available and offer top-ups for post-disaster. And projects that have been implemented following specific crises to help Fijians rebuild, access funds, and earn cash for work. So recently, the minister also commenced pilot climate risk insurance for social welfare beneficiaries. This was something that we had implemented in this financial year. So in prior years, the cluster developed the Code of Conduct for Humanitarian Workers in Fiji. Following on from this, the cluster developed and reviewed the Fiji Evacuation Center guidelines in consultation with the National Disaster Management Office to ensure they safeguard women and children in times of disaster, and to ensure that evacuation centers have separate rooms for women and children to avoid incidences of gender-based violence, and that they can consider both protection and accessibility and the needs for other targeted vulnerable groups like persons living with disability, our senior citizens, and pregnant women. We also strengthened communications by establishing a communication working group for the cluster headed by the UNICEF. We upscaled community messaging, targeting the most vulnerable groups. The Fiji Red Cross, they shared translated messages in the three vernaculars language, the Itauke, Hindi, and English for the cluster members. Then the cluster communications working group was set up to modify information so it was suitable for children. The same process was undertaken in relation to GBV. This working group also reviewed and shared their communication information developed by other cluster member agencies, such as isolation or social distancing guidelines, to ensure they are women and children friendly. So this group, they linked to a wider regional communication group working on COVID-19 information materials through WHO, UNFPA, and UNICEF. The Ministry of Women established women-friendly spaces in key locations, which provides a safe space for women and children during disasters and provide counseling, health, and information services. So a gender-based violence working group, they produce a community-based response and referral guidelines. Resource kits was developed to guide frontline responders in responding to gender-based violence and child protection cases. And this includes adapting referral pathways using telephone and online capacities, and was distributed to more than 60 stakeholders. So Fiji improved early warning systems contribute to relatively few people being seriously injured in disasters. But natural disasters, they create conditions that can increase the risk of injury and exposed to diseases. And the time and energy burden of these impacts fall on women and girls as primary caregivers, although they too may face health challenges. Fiji women's domestic and caring roles mean their actions are central to disaster preparedness, making sure there are stores of food and water, safeguarding valuable possessions in and around the house, and preparing children and other family members for possible evacuation. However, due to the care burden on women, it is often challenging to ensure they participate in high-level decision making, and in that input is considered in planning. To address this, the Ministry of Women, in partnership with us at the Ministry of Economy, have commenced the rollout of a gender transformative institutional capacity building initiative to build gender analysis skills across government and strengthen gender responsive budgeting, among other things. So working to ensure in future all ministries, they can carefully consider inclusion of women in resourcing and planning. And this is where the gender responsive budgeting comes in, to ensure that women through government programs and activities participate in our budget process. So one of our budget process that we have implemented a couple of years ago is having wide consultations with communities, even including specific consultations with women, specific consultations with young girls. So it's something that we really adopted in our process, which is the consultation phase, to try and hear out from them what are their views. And this information is taken in by and distributed or disseminated to the ministries, relevant ministries, which they are then, a part of it are put into their design and planning, and then they submitted it through the budget process. So this is one way we have tried to improve that area, considering women's participation in our budget process as well. So it is also worth highlighting that our National Development and our National Disaster Management Office is working with the UN Women Resilience Project to engage a gender specialist who will work full-time with the office, with the Disaster Management Office, with the main responsibility to gender sensitize their policy and their standard operation procedures, aligning it to the existing frameworks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kalara. I would now like to move to our speaker from Canada, but I need to check, Naima. I see you joined, but just want to make sure we can also hear us and that we can hear you. Naima, can you unmute yourself?
I think she's having issues with the connection.
Okay, and then we will try to sort that out, and I'll check what the issues are and try to resolve those. But in the meantime, Eliana, I then suggest we turn to you to learn more about the work you have been doing. So Eliana has been leading our engagements under the Canada Caribbean Resilience Facility to assess to what extent is gender integrated in disaster risk management policies across the 9 countries in the Caribbean. And the way she's done it is to really understand that women and girls are disproportionately impacted due to existing inequalities regarding access to endowments, economic opportunities, and agency. So, Eliana, we would love to hear from you what were some of the main findings of your study, but also some of the recommendations for the future. So over to you, Eliana.
Thank you, Urshka. Well, first for inviting me to this session. It's a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to share the results of these studies. We basically did 9 notes on gender and DRM in the Caribbean, and also a portfolio review of the operations that we as the World Bank support to integrate gender. Basically, the analysis focused on 3 main areas. The first one on gender differences in exposure, vulnerability, preparedness, and coping capacity. Second, gender in DRM policies, as you mentioned. And third, we also look at the integration of gender in the projects that we support countries with. In general, I think the short answer to your question is that there is a lot of room for improvement on the integration of gender in DRM policies as well as programs, projects. We found that in the analysis that I mentioned, gender differences in exposure, vulnerability, preparedness, and coping capacity, that in general, gender gaps tend to widen during disasters because of existing inequalities that put women at a disadvantage to begin with, right? And this includes in the areas of health, education, livelihoods, access to assets, but also exposure to gender-based violence. A very interesting finding is that even in cases where we see that there are no gender differences, for instance, in terms of access to technology and access to mobile phones and so on, there might be disadvantages when we look at the intersection between gender and, for instance, race or ethnicity or geographic area. So those are areas that we do have to pay attention to because women are men and men are not homogeneous groups. Right? So ideally, that's something that we would like to recommend to focus a little bit more on that intersection between gender and other characteristics that might put people at a disadvantage. Then, in terms of gender in DRM policies, again, there is a lot of room for improvement. There is a lot of variation across the 9 countries, but in general, we do see that there is little gender content in the national policies, particularly when it comes to climate change. So definitely an area where countries can work a little bit more. Where we do see that there is more effort to integrate gender, let's put it that way, is on specific sector plans, right? So let's say something that has to do with the forests, for instance. Those plans do tend to integrate gender more systematically than the broader national level policies, and in particular through consultations with women and men for the formulation of such plans. And then in the third area, which is gender integration of gender in specific projects, particularly those supported by the World Bank, we do see a lot of focus on emergency response, restoration of livelihoods, housing, also safety nets in particular. Um, but we also see there is room for improvement in areas that we know are very important, yet we could do more. For instance, the prevention of gender-based violence, as well as the protocols to respond to these cases during disasters, also the provision of care services, not only during disasters, but also more as a permanent solution. And finally, everything that has to do with intersectionality, as I mentioned before. For some reason, probably because of the lack of data in the region, we tend to see women and men as homogeneous groups, and that's not the case. So ideally, projects and policies should take that into consideration. So go beyond just the binary on one hand, and then on the other hand, also to consider the intersection with race, ethnicity, and geographic location. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Eliana. Thank you for sharing those insights. I just got a message that our speaker from Canada still has technical issues, so hopefully Naima can join us shortly nonetheless, but it seems there are some issues with her microphone, and hopefully that's resolved shortly. So in this first part of our panel discussion, we wanted to very much focus on integrating gender in disaster risk management. But in the second part, we want to look at how to integrate gender in budgeting. So in the way governments prepare and implement their budgets. As I mentioned in the introduction, we now know that there are more than 80 countries around the world that systematically integrate gender in budgeting, but also in disaster risk management. But there's still more to be done. And one of the major lessons learned for me working with countries around the world in helping them prepare their budgets is that the budget is always the key policy document. It's the best way to look at whether the government is really committed to implementing the policies that they said that they would deliver. And what we often, unfortunately, often see is that when you look at the budget for disaster risk management is very limited. And also that there's rarely integration of gender considerations in how those policies are designed. But I know, as we already heard from Antigua and Barbuda and from Fiji, that there are some great examples of how that is done. So I do want to go back to some of the work you've been doing, Jamie, but particularly, I already mentioned we did this assessment in 2019 in Antigua and Barbuda as part of the Canada Caribbean Resilience Facility. And what we noticed is that although Antigua and Barbuda does not officially undertake what we call gender budgeting, so systematically integrating gender in the design of budget policies, the government nonetheless does quite a lot on this, right? So any new investment project in Antigua and Barbuda also has to have an analysis of what the impact will be on gender and on gender equality. And we also see some gender information presented in the budget documentation. But I know that you and others in the government have been trying to really kind of expand on that and make it work in the future. So any updates you could give us on how the government has been trying to really more systematically integrate gender in PFM, in public financial management, we would appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. So as you said, definitely we do not have it all put together in terms of having that overarching policy as some other countries may have in terms of how they are integrating systemically gender into their budgets. But as you said, we have begun certain processes. As I would have said earlier, through the Ministry of Finance, they have definitely taken steps in terms of their sensitization and training to ensure that different ministries and departments have that understanding of what gender responsive budgeting actually is. And so that way, even in the absence of certain policy frameworks, we're still able to ensure that all activities and projects that we implement are actually gender responsive. And I can say particularly, this is the Understanding Risk Conference looking at disaster risk management, climate change. The Gender Affairs Department in Antigua is strategically located within the same ministry as our disaster management agency. And as a result, we've been able to work quite a bit in conjunction to execute certain activities and to ensure that the budgets and the resources that are available and that are limited for disaster risk management also are being implemented by those key disaster risk management practitioners with a gendered lens. And so our disaster office has a number of trainings from flood-based management, impact-based forecasting, early warning systems, and they have definitely made it a point to always include us from everything from presentations to being able to actually have that kind of cross-sectoral capacity exchange of knowledge, which is so critical, because you can't be a gender equality practitioner and want to mainstream gender into disaster risk management, but not understand the principles and core tenets of basically disaster risk management, and it goes vice versa. In addition to that as well, with support from UNICEF, the disaster office as well as gender affairs was able to train shelter managers in terms of understanding how to allocate resources and to foster an environment within shelter spaces that is not conducive to things like gender-based violence, which globally statistics indicate dramatically increase during those periods. Obviously, in an emergency context, key response services and response providers, their capacity is diminished due to the constraints brought about by whatever respective hazard is impending at that time. We've also been able to have guidelines created for the medical hospitals team so that in disaster settings, they also are aware of how to ensure that they are taking a gender responsive approach towards the service provision that they are having. And I think this is noteworthy because resources within a small island developing state are very limited and it's very competitive, especially when the funding is from regional and international development agencies. And so I think the collaborative approach we've been able to take with our environment department, which our disaster management department has been very effective. I think it's been very timely. What I would like to see is for us to kind of identify some more sustainable financing mechanisms so we can engage in gender responsive budgeting as it relates to climate change and disaster risk management in a more sustainable and in a more preemptive way to ensure that, single females with dependents and elderly men who maybe weren't there for children and are now alone in their older life, persons with disabilities that we have such a weak infrastructure for in the Caribbean in general, in a lot of instances, that they can have their resilience increased. I know our environment department controls the Sustainable Island Resource Framework Fund, which does allow certain groups to apply to be able to get climate resilient housing, which is amazing because it is actually a way to kind of curb the perpetuation of just building back, but not building back better, and then being stuck in that loop. I'll just stop there because of the time constraints, but in the long run, what I really would like us to see is for us to continue to build upon the work that we are doing and to have a more cohesive approach, even outside of gender and the disaster practitioners, but even all the other key players, such as civil society, to ensure we all have an understanding of gender responsive disaster risk management and budgeting.
Thank you very much, Jamie. Impressive work in Antigua and Barbuda. Very much also thanks to your engagement on this. And Calera, I now want to turn to you because for those of you who perhaps haven't worked in the Pacific, Fiji is absolutely considered as a champion of integrating gender in the way they design and implement their budget policies. And it's often in the region, in the Pacific, that other countries look to Fiji to learn more. And all these engagements are really down to Calera. So she's been leading all the work on integrating gender in budgeting in Fiji, really working with ministries across different sectors to make it work. So I think, Kalara, for us is to understand, what would you say have been some of the key success factors? How have you made it work in Fiji, and what could be replicated elsewhere?
Thanks. Okay, I guess for Fiji, if I would have looked at this, there would be a couple of things that I would have seen that could be something that we can learn from this. Is really, especially in the Pacific, when the cultures are different, and the culture is different from other countries. So things that work in Fiji may not work in other countries as well. But one of the things that I would say that really is required for you to get things done is one is to really a person who can influence. Because really, like for me, I've worked in government for more than a decade, and I've been able to have networks in other government ministries and agencies as well. So it was easy for me to work with them at that level of high positions because I know them well. And not only to get them to do this, but to help them understand. And that's the second point that I wanted to get, was to help change their mindset, to help them understand what gender is. Because if you say the word gender, the first thing that comes to mind, okay, that's another women's program. That's empowering women. We've already got so much things that we are doing for women. Interestingly, when we worked for Tonga, they treat their women like princes. So when we try to influence the politicians, they were not looking at us, they were looking away. But those are some of the experiences that you get in the Pacific culture. But for us in Fiji, that was one of the things that I find that can make things work if you are at that level and really grasp this well. And it is one way as well that we are able to get our political support, really trying to influence our cabinet in approving this. So that's one of the first things that we did, is to really get them to approve this and understand why this is important. One of our budget process is undertaking consultation with our ministers at the ministerial level to help them to understand the budget. And that is the forum that we used to also present about gender responsive budgeting, to help them understand. So trying to already set their mindset from that level. And I think for us, it was easy because of our minister was very supportive. And one of the things that the Ministry of Women actually also developed is the Gender Transformative Institutional Capacity Development, which we call the ICD. And this is actually to support, with the support of the Ministry of Economy, is to really create that environment to ensure the integration of women and girls in ministries, programs, and activities. So with this ICD, we worked very closely with the Ministry of Women. I know a lot of countries, they don't work, the Ministry of Finance don't work closely with the other ministries, government line ministries. But this is very important. If you will want this to work, you need to work well with your line ministries. And that is one of the things that we saw that really helped us a lot, because GRB is actually implemented through the budget process, which is the process of the Ministry of Finance. And to get the support from the line ministries, you need to really work well with them. And through this ICD, we worked together with the Ministry of Women, providing capacity building to other ministries. Right now, we have 8 ministries that we have piloted GRB to. We have another 8 that we will be bringing on board in the next financial year. And by 2024, we plan to complete the full process of bringing on all the ministries into the GRB process, and then we will continue with them. But it's actually a phase-out program, so we don't want to rush them into this as well, because they are still trying to grasp what gender is and what gender responsive budgeting is. So we are doing a lot of capacity building, and I would like to see some funders here if they can support us in terms of capacity building, because ADB is currently assisting us, is supporting us in this area, but they worked with us in the initial stage, but we know there's a lot of work that can be done. And if we can get some funding support from some donors in Canada or in the Caribbean, that'll be really good to help us in our capacity building process, because that is where a lot of need is required. So that work with the Ministry of Women is really continuing. And one of the things we actually done through this ICD program that's administered by the Ministry of Women, one of the requirements is establishment of gender mainstreaming groups. Usually before what they had done, they actually selected only one person as a gender focused person, but then it didn't work because whenever they have meetings, they would bring in a admin officer, they would bring in someone at the lower position, but when they go back, nothing is done. So through this ICD, because it is also approved by cabinet, they had established these GMAC groups, and what we have done is getting the permanent secretaries or a director at the next level to be the chair of these GMAC groups. And our permanent secretary from the Ministry of Economy is a champion in gender in this. So I had to really push him to become the champion in this so that he can influence his permanent secretaries. And that is one of the ways that it has really been working well for us in Fiji. So as part of also of our, and one of the things we've done recently, we've developed from the Ministry of Economy, we've taken the first step in even, not the first step, but Ministry of Agriculture was one of the ministries that has really been working well with their gender work, gender programs. They've been mainstreaming this into their programs and activities. So that was good for them. And they are now really working with us too on this. So one of the things we've done, we have established our own Ministry of Economy gender policy, which we call the JESI policy. And that is to mainstream gender in all the government, on all the main divisions, programs and activities. So for us, like in the budget and planning division, one of our main core work is budget planning. So that's how we're going to mainstream gender. And that's what we have done for all other divisions. So through this process, we are working on our new public sector infrastructure project guideline, our 5-year national infrastructure investment plan, and our new budget system, which are all going together in this financial year. And we are working on these 3 important projects. And I'm really happy to say that we have really mainstream gender in all these documents and the system as well. One of the challenges that we have faced is in terms of tagging. How do we tag these into the system? And this was one of the indicators that we had used as part of the framework, which really URSCA is the main developer of that framework, which we had used to assess gender in our budget process in the initial stage. So that is one of the areas that we are working on. And because we are working on our information financial system, we are working with a consultant on how we can look at gender in our financial information system as well. And which will better our reporting on that. And I guess those are some of the things that we've really, improved in our areas. And the last thing that we've just done recently is done a stock pick on the 8 ministries. And we have learned so much with the ministries as compared to 2019 when we started. When we asked about gender, no one said anything about it. But now when they are talking to us about GRB, it's like they become an expert again to us. So it's good to know that they have finally grasped what GRB is. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clara. I believe our speaker from Canada, Naima, continues to have technical issues, but I just want to check. Naima, are you able to hear us? And can we hear you? I think it's really unfortunate that we don't have Naima joining us from Canada, and particularly because I think Canada is such a wonderful example. In Canada, any ministry that proposes a new budget policy, be it in education or in health or any other sector, has to do a thorough gender impact assessment of that policy proposal. And it's really impressive to see how they do it across all the ministries. But for that, what they do is they very much rely on systematic approach to collecting sex disaggregated data and using it, right, to design budget policies. And Eliana, although we don't have Naima here, I do want to turn to you on the question of sex disaggregated data, because what we've seen for any meaningful analysis, right, in disaster risk management, in doing gender responsive budgeting, what you really need is credible sex disaggregated data to inform your design of policies. But unfortunately, one thing we've seen in the Caribbean, but also in other regions of the world, that there's not necessarily a systematic approach to how you do that. So my question to you, Eliana, is, what are the options for small island developing states, like what we see in the Caribbean, to do meaningful integration, mainstreaming of gender in disaster risk management, in budgeting, also in circumstances where we don't necessarily always have the availability of sex disaggregated data. So over to you, Eliana.
Thanks, Ushka. Yes, as you mentioned, the lack of data in the Caribbean is definitely an issue, and particularly when it comes to the intersection of gender and DRM. So it's a problem or a challenge because then it is difficult to formulate policies or projects, for instance, in our case. A few suggestions or options for countries to think about it. I think a really important investment is administrative records. So collecting household surveys on a regular basis is expensive, and oftentimes the countries do not have the capacity or the budget to do so. So it is important to actually take this as a systematic approach to improving any form of administrative data that the country collects, particularly when it comes to disaster response and preparedness. Another option, which is something we have been doing to measure the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, is to collect high frequency phone surveys. Those tend to be cheaper than actual household surveys, also smaller. Obviously, in some cases, they are not representative at the national level, but they do give you a sense of the situation of women and men in the country. That's another approach, and we had the possibility to include in the last round of high frequency surveys that we conducted in a few countries in the Caribbean to integrate a module on DRM. It was mainly focused on perceptions about exposure to disasters, but it was very useful to understand that there are differences in the way that women and men perceive their exposure to disasters, and also the way they are prepared to respond to a disaster, right? So that's definitely something that countries can consider as a cheaper way to collect sex disaggregated data, also on DRM, um, and try to do it on a more frequent basis, let's put it that way. Another idea, which we often use when we are supporting project teams at the World Bank, is to rely on consultations. I know it's not ideal for the formulation of specific interventions, but in the absence of data, I think it's a source of information that should not be undervalued. So, um, inviting women and men from different geographic areas with different ethnic profiles and so on, I think will go a long way in the formulation of national policies, sector plans, as well as specific interventions at the project level. And, and finally, I think we should also take advantage of technology. As I mentioned at the beginning, we found in general that gender gaps in access to technology, mobile phones, and so on are relatively small in the Caribbean. So why not taking that opportunity to use big data and try to identify specific issues, like gender issues, when it comes to preparedness, response, and so on. The big data can also be used to predict welfare. So definitely a source of information that should be taken into consideration in the context of lack of household surveys and regular data collection at the country level. Thank you.
Super. Many thanks, Eliana. And with this, I believe we have 5 more minutes until the end of the session. So now I want to open to you. So if you have any questions to our panelists, so Jamie, Calera, or Eliana, please do raise your hand and I'll come with my microphone. And please ask a question. Yeah.
Hi, thank you, and excellent presentations, I think. I'm Omar Sweeney, I'm from the Jamaica Social Investment Fund, and I would love to hear from all or any one presenter what are some of the tools and the metrics that are used to really determine that you are doing and getting the results that you're speaking of? So if you want to integrate more gender consideration or you want to do gender budgeting, then what is the tool? What is the metric that tells you that you are achieving, some margin above the baseline?
Thank you very much. I mean, I can start and respond, and then you can chime in. Is that okay? So the way we've really seen gender budgeting work globally, I mean, it's very different approaches that countries have taken. But probably most successful are those countries that include what we call performance information in their budget system. So every line ministry would explain what it's trying to achieve. What are the objectives of each of its policies? For example, in education, what do you want to achieve in secondary education, let's say? And in the budget documentation, typically governments present what are the objectives, how will the success be measured, so what are some of the targets? And countries that do gender budgeting include sex desegregated information on those. For example, I'll give you an example of a country in the Caribbean. What they identify as part of their gender gap analysis is that young boys ages 13 to 15, 30% of them do not finish secondary school, although secondary school is mandatory in that country, right? And that's causing all sorts of issues, kind of having opportunities entering the labor market, finding meaningful jobs, and so forth. So the idea is that those issues, you find solutions and translate them into your budget policies and then fund them. So this is really what we mean when we talk about gender budgeting, identifying what your gender gaps are and make sure they are reflected in your budget proposals and adequately presented in your budget documentation. So hopefully, that example gives it's a way of how gender budgeting can work, but we've seen countries also doing it through gender responsive procurement in the way goods and services are purchased. We've seen parliaments doing scrutiny of budget proposals, and we've seen Supreme Audit Institution doing similar. So a variety of different approaches, but probably using your budget system is your best way. I don't know if you wanted to, yeah?
Yeah, thanks. I'll be brief. I think that's a very relevant question. I think it would vary from country to country and island to island. I can say in Antigua and Barbuda, even outside of gender and gender equality, one of our hugest institutional gaps is our lack of both capacity to collect comprehensive data across a number of priority sectors, as well as the ability for us to have meaningful analysis that will serve as the foundation of evidence-based interventions. But what I can say is the advantage in terms of gender and gender equality and gender budgeting. One thing that we can do, even notwithstanding those challenges I would have just mentioned, is that we oftentimes do get support from, like the Caribbean Development Bank, UN Women, UNDP, World Bank, to do prevalence studies, to do assessments. We did a country gender assessment in Antigua in 2015. And because it's very cross-cutting, the issue of gender, even poverty assessments, which are done periodically, all of these are able to serve as basically a framework that we can resort to kind of try to identify some patterns and also to, on a smaller scale, do our own due diligence to try and validate that, compare it to regional trends, and be able to then try to, implement accordingly, as opposed to taking a more anecdotal approach or outlook to the issue.
Maybe just to add on, I like your question, the fact that when we just did our stock taking with the 8 pilot ministries, one of the things that we actually realized is the framework that is required, that needs to be developed by the Ministry of Women. And the Ministry of Women has a national gender policy, but for ministries to actually understand what is it, the target that they are trying to achieve, there needs to be a framework where it has specific sector indicators that they know that they're actually achieving it. So if I'm from the Ministry of Education, like you said, or Ministry of Health, and I'm doing gender analysis, impact analysis, So when I'm doing GRB, they need to know what is it that the programs that we are undertaking, that we are going to achieve this, which is actually aligned to what we know is our 2020-30 SDG goals. So that is one of the things that we actually identified, and we had raised that with the Ministry of Women. And also because we are currently finalizing our Fiji country gender assessment. So that's been one of the Ministry of Economy's comments to the Ministry of Women, the need to put in place a framework. Just a one-page, just simple, doesn't have to be complicated, with indicators, sector specific, so that the ministries, when they're doing GRB work, they'll be able to align to those targets and know that they're achieving the outcomes of gender.
Thank you very much. Oh, I see now we have questions. Yes, Rigoberts, please.
Thank you, Oscar, panelists. Great job. My name is Esther Rigobert. I am the Permanent Secretary from the Office of the Prime Minister in St. Lucia. My question stems from the discussion that is being had now from the question from my colleague here. To ensure your gender-based or gender-responsive budgeting is relevant, I think it would have to be against the backdrop of a strategic plan for your country that takes into consideration whatever gaps there may be in your economic development, your sustainable goals, and what you hope to achieve in the long term. So to ask ministries to just ensure that their budget proposals are gender responsive in isolation outside of the context of a strategic plan for your country, for its development, I think is counterproductive. That's just my personal view. I don't know what the panelists believe. But more importantly, I'm just concerned that as we progress from decade to decade, the focus changes to respond to the emergent needs. But I'm not sure if that's the most effective way of developing small Caribbean countries, small island states. So the issue now is gender. We focus on gender responsive budgeting. In 10 years, the story might be different. It might be
Green
it could
budgeting.
be anything, disability, climate change, budgeting, and so on. How do we prepare and not just be responsive and reactive? So that's my question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Yep. Well, I mean, I think we can take another question if that's okay, and then we'll try and respond to those. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sherrod James, Director of the National Office of Disaster Services, Antigua and Barbuda. Just in support in relation to the previous question and to support what Jamie was saying, in terms of how we go about planning, in terms of the long-term planning and developing the country work program, it is through the results-based management system which SEDIMA has adopted as the regional way in which we plan our multi-year work programs. And this is for all SEDIMA participating states. And SEDIMA has an overall regional strategy that they've been doing now for the past 10 years. And every 4 years, they actually revamp that strategy. And there's a comprehensive disaster management audit that is done within country every 2 years, which looks at your gaps. And in terms of what are the overall goals moving forward based on what our current risk profile looks like and what our likely risk profile is going to look at when you take into the context of climate change and other development parameters. So gender specific issues, gender is one of the cross-cutting themes that is managed throughout the actual results-based management process. So in terms of the areas that I've highlighted, in terms of the 4 main sectors, institutional strengthening, key sector involvement, community participation in terms of public awareness, and then looking at mainstreaming others. And then for the 5th section, they've added what we looked at in terms of coming out of the pandemic with biological hazards. We've identified key hazards and profiles in the region. And as such, that being done at the regional level, it is now mirrored at the national level to support that. And therefore, when the national countries are developing their multi-year country work programs, those are taken into account to actually look at the individual national profiles, but in support of the overall regional strategy so that you have a measure of sustainability in dealing with, analyzing, preparing for, responding to, mitigating against, and recovering from. And that is always done going over and over. So you have that 2-year cycle where you audit what you're doing with your partners, and then they audit your partners to see what are the necessary gaps, what is being met, what needs to be challenged. And then you use the information from that to actually fuel your actual results-based management development your project management framework and your logic framework analysis, etc. going forward.
Exactly. And then hopefully there are enough funds at the end to also pay for what you're trying to achieve. Would you like to come in on the two questions that were posed to us? Yeah? Or I will definitely respond to that. Yeah.
Well, one that I remember that you asked would have had to do with you saying that, okay, right now the big trend is gender responsive budgeting. Suppose it's climate responsive budgeting. But I think one of the good things about gender responsive budgeting is that despite many misconceptions that gender is just about women, gender is about men, gender is about persons living with disabilities, gender is about climate change. And that's the beauty of it. It's very cross-cutting. Literally anything that you can think about, gender encompasses. And it's just about really transforming mindsets in terms of the way we look at things and understanding that there is a more technical and in-depth way to navigate through these issues to ensure that we're taking a holistic approach and not minimizing gender responsive anything to just be looking at a very rigid or narrow outlook. And I think adhering to that will allow us to be able to adapt that gendered lens and concept to whatever the eminent issue of the day is.
Thank you very much, Jamie. I think that was beautifully put. And initiatives like gender green budgeting, to me, it's really about good budgeting. So thinking through, who are the recipients of your budget policies, of public services, of public programs, right? I mean, just acknowledging that, in the society, people have diverging needs. So it's really thinking through in the design, right, how we can design our budget to respond to that. And I do think, P.S. Rigobert, you're very correct. I mean, all this way of integrating policy with budgeting need to be focused on what the government's priorities are, right? I mean, gender budgeting, where we've seen succeed, like in Fiji, is where there was a clear articulation of gender gaps. And exactly also, as Jamie said, not just about some of the women issues, but what are the issues faced by boys, girls, men, women, people with disabilities, right? And thinking through, are the policies we're designing the right policies that address those issues? And you can argue the same for disaster risk management, for climate change, right? And seeing through, can we or should we redesign some of those policies, but then also make sure we do have funds available in the budget to implement them. So green budgeting, gender budgeting, if you ask me, it's really good budgeting. Yeah. And with that, I do think we need to end. We have a plenary session, the last session of the day. Yes, you still wanted to come in? Yeah, okay. Please, Clara.
I just wanted to say, with what I've experienced, when we started with this GRB, one of the things that we experience is that, like what you mentioned about strategic planning, one of the things we've seen is that they always have plans in place, but to really translate that to budgeting, the ministries don't know how to do that when it comes to gender. So I think that's one of the things that we actually learned through this gender budgeting process, this GRB process, that ministries already have gender indicators in their strategic plans, but they don't know how to address that or to translate it to budget. And that's why they never requested for that specific area or the gaps that they have identified. So it was through this process that we were able to do that as well. And it really pushed for sex disaggregated data as well, that the ministry start collecting sex disaggregated data, which they never used to do in most of their programs as well. Yeah, thanks.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So we do have to end this session, but I mean, if there's one message that we should take away from this session is that both disasters and budgets are not gender neutral. And it is important that we think through how these different policies and programs affect different segments of the population. But also, if you want to learn more about that, please do join us for our training on this topic on integrating gender in disaster risk management and gender in budgeting on Thursday at the University of Santa Catarina. It's from 2 to 5 p.m. We would love to have you there. But for now, thank you very much for joining this session. Thank you to our excellent panelists. Thank you, Clara. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Eliana. And enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.